In the wake of China's humiliating defeat at the hands of the British during the First Opium War, seething resentment at the newly established peace faction that sought to undermine the dynastic government's ability to stand up to colonial pressure threatened to spill over into open conflict once again. As a result of British victory in August 1842 during the First Opium War, the Treaty of Nanking, signed essentially at gunpoint by the Chinese diplomats as colonial troops threatened the vital imperial city, granted an indemnity and extraterritoriality to Britain, the opening of 5 treaty ports, and the handover of Hong Kong Island. However, while the treaty had been signed and the ports opened to British merchants, the Chinese dragged their feet on implementing the agreements, and legal trade with China remained limited. British merchants pressed their government to do more, but this was hampered by Parliament's inability to open direct lines of communication with the Emperor due to the stiff restrictions as to who could receive an audience with the imperial royal family in Peking's Forbidden City. At the same time, the First Opium War was a highly controversial and deeply unpopular one among the British public and political class, who saw its outcomes as simply an exercise in colonial expansionism and the support of an extremely damaging trade that had crippled large swathes of the Chinese population across all social levels. However, none were more opposed to the outcomes of the treaty than the Emperor himself. The Daoguang Emperor had been involved in the First War and remained highly suspicious of the Western powers, especially as they now moved in to secure their place on the Chinese mainland. Acts of hostility continued to bubble against the foreigners, culminating in April 1847 in the expedition to Canton, a British punitive action that captured forts along the Pearl River as a response to the harassment of British subjects in Canton. The Hong Kong governor, John Davis, demanded redress from the Chinese commissioner Qi Ying with regard to attacks on British merchants around Canton, though no action was forthcoming, and thus Davis ordered Major General George de Guillard, the commander-in-chief of British forces in China, to seize the forts approaching Canton and prepare for an attack on the city. Taking control of the forts and capturing 879 guns, Canton was spared from British assault after Qi Ying agreed to punish the culprits and allow entry into the city, this move being yet another embarrassing blow to the ability of the Chinese power to stand up to the demands of the colonial forces. In February 1850, the Daoguang Emperor died at the age of 67, being succeeded by his 4th son, the 19-year-old Xianfeng Emperor. The new monarch, despite his young age, was singularly resentful of the outcomes of the First Opium War, and was a fervent admirer of the Chinese diplomat who had cracked down so hard on the opium trade in Canton, Lin Zexu. Lin, who had been made a scapegoat by the Daoguang Emperor for his perceived responsibility in starting a war China couldn't possibly win, was now in exile in the remote Xinjiang region of western China, where he lived a quiet life as a scholar. Upon the rise of the new emperor in 1850, motions were made to return Lin to the Chinese imperial court so as to develop another hardline strategy against the British intruders. Unfortunately, the elderly Lin died in November of the same year at the age of 65, while on his way back to Peking. Further disturbing the new emperor's reign was the sudden emergence of the Taiping Rebellion in December 1850. This was led by Chinese revolutionary and spiritual leader Hong Xiquan, who proclaimed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ and used the general instability of the dynastic government to rally his forces in open revolt against Confucianism and the rule of an imperial royal family, thus beginning a protracted civil conflict that would last until August 1864. Meanwhile, tension between the Chinese and colonial powers continued to mount, culminating on October 8, 1856, when Imperial Marines in Canton seized a cargo ship called the Arrow on suspicion of piracy, arresting 12 of its 14 Chinese crew members. The Arrow, which had previously been used by pirates, was captured by the Chinese government and subsequently resold, despite the fact that it was then registered as a British ship. At the time of its detention, the ship was still flying a British flag, to which its captain, Thomas Kennedy, who was aboard a nearby vessel at the time, reportedly saw Chinese Marines pull down the ensign from the ship. This led to a heated dispute between Harry Parkes, the British consul in Canton, and Imperial Commissioner and Viceroy of Liangguang, Ye Mingchen. Parkes demanded the release of the sailors and an apology for the alleged insult to the flag, and as a result, 9 of the crew were released, although 3 remained imprisoned. The British were far from satisfied in view of what they saw as China's violation of the Treaty of Nanking, and thus decided that this was the perfect opportunity to pressure China militarily to open itself up further to British merchants and trade. Thus, the Second Opium War officially began on October 23, 1856, when the British destroyed 4 barrier forts along the Pearl River and, 2 days later, demanded that the imperial authorities allow the British attack squadron to sail into Canton. Understandably, the Chinese refused, leading to a bombardment of the city from the following morning, with one shot fired every 10 minutes, and thus in response, Ye Ming-shen issued a bounty on every British head taken. After 3 days, with no satisfactory response from the Chinese, the Royal Navy blasted a hole in the poorly defended and inadequate city walls, allowing British troops to enter and capture the city. On November 6th, the Chinese attempted to unseat the British occupiers through the dispatch of 23 war junks against the Royal Navy, this very unequal contest leading to the Chinese being thoroughly routed by the more modern British warships. Following this, talks were held between the colonial and imperial governments, which continued until January 5, 1857, at which time it was negotiated that the British would return to Hong Kong. Back in Britain, the Arrow incident led to a major political upheaval. The Prime Minister and former Foreign Secretary during the First Opium War, Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, submitting a motion to increase the military involvement of Britain in China as a response to the seizing of a British ship and insult to the flag. This was countered by a vote of censure proposed by the Conservative opposition, Palmerston, notorious for his aggressive policies of colonial expansionism, having been a major factor behind the highly unpopular First Opium War, and thus lost this parliamentary motion by 16 votes after a heated debate. Thus followed a general election that was effectively a plebiscite on whether Palmerston should continue as Prime Minister, thus resulting in his sitting minority Whig government gaining a 100-seat majority in the House, thereby allowing for near uncontested support for the increase in military pressure against China. With Palmerston having fully secured the support of Parliament, and with the blessing of the British populace through his overwhelming victory in the general election, he sought the support of both the United States and Imperial Russia as part of his upcoming campaign against the dynastic government, though both parties ultimately rejected his proposals. The French, however, were keenly interested in seeking expansion into China, following their declaration of a most favoured nation by the imperial government in 1844. The French envoy, Baron Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros, cited the execution of French missionary Auguste Chapelle-Deslin by local Chinese authorities in the Guangxi province as a reason to mount a military expedition. However, before the British could undertake any offensive action in earnest, troops proposed for combat in China had to be diverted during May 1857 to India during what was known as the Indian Mutiny. This year-long uprising by members of the Indian sepoys against the rule of the British Empire and the British East India Company was ultimately suppressed in November 1858. Eventually, a joint Anglo-French attack force would arrive in China during late 1857 under the overall command of Admiral Sir Michael Seymour, while ground troops were led by Lord Elgin for the British and Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros for the French. These forces assembled in Hong Kong, and by December had sufficient naval power to exert military pressure on the dynastic government in Canton. On December 14th, following the issuing of an ultimatum, Canton was threatened with bombardment within 24 hours by naval vessels in the harbour, thus demanding the release of the remaining prisoners from the Arrow, and that the Qing government honour the terms of the Treaty of Nanking for free trade within the city. Ultimately, the sailors were released, but the Viceroy, Ye Ming-shen, refused to issue a formal apology, nor did he honour the treaty terms. This was followed on December 28th by the Second Battle of Canton, when British and French troops were landed in the city, thus leading to its fall 3 days later on January 1, 1858, resulting in 15 European casualties against heavy Chinese losses, which included large numbers of civilians caught in the crossfire. Upon the fall of the city, a joint committee of the alliance was formed, which would rule Canton for the next 4 years, while Ye Ming-shen was removed from command and exiled to British India, where he eventually starved himself to death out of protest. However, the position of city governor was maintained to keep order and to act as a go-between for the European occupation force and Chinese merchants and diplomats. Seeing the victory as having the potential to further open China to foreign influence, the United States and Russia dispatched envoys to Hong Kong, offering military help to the British and French, though ultimately the Russians would not provide military aid, while America was already involved in the Utah War on the Midwest frontier between Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory and the armed forces of the U.S. government. However, America had briefly been involved in the Second Opium War during November 1856, when in response to the shelling of a United States Navy steamer by the river forts near Canton, the Navy bombarded then attacked the forts of the Pearl River. In consequence of this incident, the American and Chinese governments signed an agreement promising US neutrality in the Second Opium War, thereby taking the Americans out of the wider conflict for the time being. During January 1858, the family of Hong Kong Governor Sir John Bowring was subject to an attempted assassination by poisoning when their bread was laced with arsenic, though this was thankfully unsuccessful. After the capture of Canton, and China's reluctance to once again be dragged into a war it had neither the technology nor strategies to win, they agreed to the signing of the 4 treaties of Tientsin in June 1858. The 4 treaties were drafted individually for the 4 nations involved in the campaign against China: Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. The terms of the treaties being the opening of 11 additional ports to Western trade, including Nuisang, Tamsui, Hankou, and Nanjing. The treaties also included the right for these nations to establish diplomatic legations or small embassies in the closed city of Peking, and the right for all foreign vessels, including commercial ships, to navigate freely on the Yangtze River, and the lifting of the ban on foreigners traveling to the internal regions of China. In addition, China agreed to pay an indemnity of 4 million pieces of silver to Britain and 2 million to France as compensation for losses caused by Chinese aggression. On May 28, 1858, the separate Treaty of Aigun was signed with Russia to revise the Chinese and Russian border that had been determined by the Nachinsk Treaty in 1689, Russia gaining the left bank of the Amur River, thus pushing the border south from the Stanovoy Mountains. On May 20th, the British successfully conducted the First Battle of Taku Forts, although as part of the upcoming 4 treaties agreement, these were returned to China under the expectation that the treaties were to be signed and ratified. At the beginning of June 1858, shortly after the Qing Imperial Court had agreed to the disadvantageous treaties, hawkish ministers prevailed upon the Xianfeng Emperor to resist Western encroachment. Therefore, on June 2nd, the Emperor stated his outright refusal to ratify the treaties, and ordered the Mongol general Zheng Rinchen, a descendant of Khazar, the brother of Genghis Khan, to guard the Taku forts near Tianjin, thus seeing additional artillery pieces and 4,000 Mongol cavalry dispatched to reinforce these positions. A year after the arrival of Rinchen at the Taku forts, a British naval force with 2,200 troops and 21 ships, under the command of Admiral Sir James Hope, sailed north from Shanghai to Tianjin, with newly appointed Anglo-French envoys for the embassies in Peking. Rinchen, in answer to demands by the Europeans to land at Taku, stated that the Anglo-French envoys could not be allowed armed troops to accompany them to the Chinese capital, and were, therefore, refused access onto the Chinese mainland at Taku. In response, on the night of June 24, 1859, a small group of British forces blew up the iron obstacles that the Chinese had placed in the Beihai River, followed the next day by the British fleet forcibly sailing into the river and shelling the Taku forts. Unfortunately for the British, low tide and soft mud prevented the landing of troops, while accurate fire from Rinchen's cannons sent 4 British gunboats to the bottom and severely damaged a further 2. American Commodore Josiah Tattenall III, commanding the chartered steamship Toei-1, broke his orders of neutrality by firing upon the Taku forts so as to protect the British retreat. As a result of the battle, 81 British and 12 French were killed against 32 Chinese, and the Royal Navy suffered a heavy blow to their prestige that served to give resolve to the Qing defenders. The victory at Taku would not be celebrated for long, as, with the Indian Mutiny finally quelled, Sir Colin Campbell, Commander-in-Chief in India, was free to amass troops and supplies for another offensive in China, and after a 13-month stalemate, the British and French returned with a much larger attack force on August 12, 1860. This amounted to 11,000 British troops under General James Hope Grant and 6,700 French troops under General Cousin Montauban, supported by a naval fleet of 173 ships from Hong Kong. The Western assault first captured the port cities of Yantai and Dalian, enabling the blockade of the Bohai Gulf, followed by the capture of Beitang, approximately 2 miles from Taku, enabling a siege of the forts to take place, which after 3 weeks led to their surrender on August 21st, and the city of Tianjin on August 23rd. In an attempt to negotiate a peace treaty, a delegation comprising British envoys Henry Locke and Harry Smith Parkes, Times journalist Thomas William Bowlby, and their entourage of Sikh soldiers and coolies set off for Peking, but before they could reach the capital, they were arrested by Rinchen and subsequently tortured over the course of many days, which led to the deaths of several members. Following the imprisonment of the envoys and their entourage at the hands of the Mongol warrior, Anglo-French forces clashed with Rinchen's cavalry on September 18th at the Battle of Zhangshai 1, and victory enabled the Allies to advance on the suburbs of Peking. On September 21st, at Bali Chao, also known as 8 Mile Bridge, Rin Chen's 10,000 troops, including the elite Mongol cavalry, were annihilated after doomed frontal charges against the concentrated firepower of the Anglo-French forces. This overwhelming victory seeing the French being able to capture the ancient summer palace outside Peking on October 6th, followed by British troops the next day. In order to force the release of Parkes and his entourage, the British commanders ordered the Imperial Summer Palace, a complex and garden where Qing Dynasty emperors had traditionally handled the country's official matters, to be looted by their soldiers, leading, on October 8th, to Parkes and his few surviving comrades being released from Chinese custody. The British were appalled by the extent of the torture suffered by the imprisoned diplomats, the prisoners having had their limbs bound with rope until their flesh was lacerated and became infected with maggots, while dirt was forced into their throats. In addition, the Sikh soldiers had been beheaded and their bodies thrown to the animals, and the coolies buried up to their necks, where they were devoured by wild dogs. In retaliation, the British forces considered burning the Forbidden City, but instead settled on destroying the Imperial Summer Palace, which was razed to the ground on October 18th, destroying furnishings and artwork that dated back a millennia. The most criminal loss during the looting was the 1408 Ming Dynasty Yongle Encyclopedia, the largest encyclopedia ever compiled in world history, that was burned by the British troops, leaving only 3.5% of surviving volumes today. In the wake of the Qing army's destruction at the Battle of Tongzhou outside Peking, colonial forces entered the imperial capital, the Xianfeng Emperor fleeing to the Chengde Summer Palace in order to avoid capture, and thus left his brother, Prince Gong, to take charge of peace negotiations. Ultimately, this led to a complete surrender under Anglo-French terms on October 24th, finally resulting in the ratification of the 4 treaties of Tientsin by the Convention of Peking. Under the convention, China was not only forced to sign the Treaty of Tientsin, but was also required to open Tianjin as a trade port, while No. 1 district of Kowloon, south of the present-day Boundary Street, was to be ceded to Britain, alongside freedom of religion to be allowed in China, while British ships were permitted to carry indentured Chinese to the Americas. The opium trade was also to be legalized, and the already punitive indemnity to Britain and France would be increased to 8 million pieces of silver for each nation. This was followed 2 weeks later by a separate negotiation with Russia, whereupon China ceded the maritime provinces east of the Ussuri River to Russian Manchuria, leading to the founding of the modern port city of Vladivostok between 1860 and 1861. In Britain, while Palmerston had been somewhat vilified after the First Opium War as a brutal expansionist, his conduct and triumph in the Second Opium War was celebrated by the British press and public, and his popularity as Prime Minister reached its very pinnacle. British merchants, meanwhile, were delighted at the prospect of the expansion of trade in the Far East, while other foreign powers sought to take advantage of China's weakened state by establishing their own colonial presence on the Chinese mainland. For Imperial China, the blow of losing both opium wars to a relatively small contingent of British and French invaders was a crippling one to the prestige of the nation on the global stage. The burning of the Summer Palace, while an act of wanton vandalism, being a symbolic indication that China's ancient practices and culture were no longer compatible with the modern industry of the Western powers. As for the Xianfeng Emperor, his reign would come to an end less than a year later, on August 22, 1861, when he died following years of rich living and overindulgence in exile at the Chengde mountain resort. He was thus succeeded by the 6-year-old Tongzhi Emperor, ruling under the regency of 8 appointed ministers, whose edicts would have to be endorsed by noble consort Yi and Empress consort Zhen, who were known as the Empress Dowagers Cixi and Si Yan. However, Cixi, who had risen from being an imperial concubine, had further aspirations to rule solely as Dowager Empress, and thus travelled ahead to Peking in order to orchestrate a coup with the late emperor's brother, Prince Gong, to oust the 8 regents. In effect, she became the ruler of China for the next 47 years, during which she would once again face the European powers in combat as part of the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. In the end, the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1850s illustrated how far the world had come with regard to modern military strategies and technology, the largely isolationist Imperial China having no answer to this show of Western might, despite their overwhelming superiority in numbers, though this alone could not compensate for the advanced weaponry of the Europeans. China, once the most significant power in the Far East, being irreparably damaged by the conflict, and now seen as a resource to be divided up between the colonial victors.